and my mama cried. Don't be a naughty Eskimo. Save your money, don't go to the show. Well, I turned around and
It's hard to know what to say about Frank Zappa. There's been a lot that's been written about him, and it'd be easy to parrot a lot of that. And if you really want to dig into his history, there's plenty to go out in there. He was a prolific recorder. Between 1966 and his death in 1993, he released 62 albums. Since then, 50 more albums have been released. He was American. He had a band in the early days called the Mothers of Invention, so some of the albums are credited to the Mothers of Invention, some to Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, and after the band was disbanded, they were just accredited to him. I think it's fair to say that the Mothers of Invention had some incredible musicians, but they were still very much led by Frank Zappa. He's musically hard to describe at times. Some of his output could be classified as progressive rock, some as jazz rock, some as avant-garde classical, and sometimes it owes more to German cabaret than anything. It can be complex. He was an amazing guitarist, and he surrounded himself with amazing musicians. He apparently got frustrated with orchestras for hire because they couldn't play what he wanted them to. And later in life, he was starting to embrace cutting-edge synths and sequencing. So sometimes the music's front and centre, but sometimes it's the backdrop to his songs. The subject matter he generally covers is social satire. It's often disguised as songs about banal things, but then sometimes he takes it just as seriously when songs truly just are about banal things. It would not be safe to put one of his albums on at work if you didn't already know what the content is, because it's often very adult, and that includes the spoken stuff on live albums. So be prepared for explicit sexual content, political commentary, and anti-religious sentiment, all of which is mixed up with a particular absurdist sense of humour. He has a cult following. Presumably some people have bought all 100-plus albums, and I've listened to a good number of them, and I'm still undecided about it. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was Frank Zappa's 18th album. I guess it depends on how you count them, but if you count the ones that are credited to Mother's Invention as well, it was the 18th that he was involved with, basically led. I think this is the first time I've reviewed it. I have reviewed several of his albums before in previous incarnations. It is the first Frank Zappa album in this list, though. And it's probably not my first listen to this, because I've probably heard over half of his albums over the years. It was it was his most commercially successful album in the USA. What I want to avoid doing is a lot of comparison with his other albums, because while I might have listened to quite a bit of Frank Zappa, I have no guarantee at all that you have. You might be coming completely fresh to it. So part of the point of these reviews is to try and give you sometimes an outside perspective of some of these albums. So if you were kind of choosing to listen to it for yourself for the first time. So I would describe it as being kind of musically in the rockish, bluesish, maybe with bits of jazz in there. And maybe there's certainly elements of what you might call prog rock in there, particularly to do with interesting rhythms and structures to the way that he does stuff. He doesn't tend to use standard song structures. He just has a narrative that kind of goes on to where he feels like taking it, it would seem. And that's the same with the instrumental tracks as well. It just goes where he wants it to. There's, as well as a kind of standard rock band stuff, there's quite a bit of brass in here, and there's a bouzouki and I believe a cello at one point. The first few tracks are a continuum that moves through from one track to the next, and they are thematically a continuum as well, but it's a bit of a dream sequence thing. There's been lots of people involved and some really good musicians. The name that jumped out at me was Jean-Luc Ponty on violin, who was a guy I've heard of. And as a result, because the different tracks are different combinations of people, there are often fairly different feels to the different tracks. So he did some bizarre things in the studio that was typical of Frank Zappa's recordings, and it's true on this album that stuff here is, some of it is stuff that was recorded for other sessions and then had overdubs and extra things added to it. The stuff that's taken out of one track and used in another track, and is forever repurposing stuff. So his process is unusual, I think. Despite all this, the whole thing is a surprisingly coherent whole. And so musically, it's quite rich. In the words, the songs are mostly, as I said, dreamlike fantasies. Some of them are actually, the first few tracks are inspired by dreams that he had. He has a bizarre sense of humour, but this album is reasonably safe for work. There's some innuendo and some toilet humour in there, but it's not particularly shocking in that sense. And it's kind of this weird fantasy world that he lives in. Now, I'm going to throw in one comparison I was reminded of, and I know potentially not many people know these albums, but there's a trilogy of albums called the Radio Gnome Invisible albums by Gong, which have this kind of weird narrative going through them, and they had a similar kind of rolling but very meandering narrative going through the album. I find it engaging. As I said, it's musically strong. I find it lyrically entertaining. And I would say that if you are wanting to try some Frank Zappa out, this is probably a good album as a starting point. It's one of the more accessible albums that I've heard of his. So I quite like it. I'd love to know what you think. So please do talk to me through the comments box. That's it from me for now.
This has to be the disease for you. Now, scientists call this disease bromidrosis. But us regular folks, who might wear tennis shoes or an occasional python boot, know this exquisite little inconvenience by the name of stink foot. You know, my python...